Hey, everybody, welcome back to the Startup Sense podcast. This is your host, Jonah Lupton. We have another awesome episode for you today. As always, if you have any feedback, feel free to email me at jonahlupton@gmail.com. Today's guest is Andrew Weinreich. He is out of New York, lifetime serial entrepreneur. He started a bunch of different companies in a bunch of different industries. He's had a bunch of exits. He's now running a boot camp called Andrew's Roadmaps. He's the chairman of a company called Indicative. He's an investor in a bunch of startups. So this guy does a ton of stuff. He runs a podcast. He does some public speaking. So he's all over the place in a good way. So I'm excited to chat with him on a lot of these different topics and see what he has to say for us. So, Andrew, welcome to the show, man. How are you?
Thank you for having me. I'm good.
Absolutely, man. Thanks for taking some time to chat with us today. So I covered a lot of different stuff in your intro. Talk to us what what are you doing these days, and maybe give us a little bit more detail on what you've done over the last 10, 15, 20 years.
Well, these days I think you put it aptly. I'm working on quite a few things. I'll provide a little more color to the background and then jump into the current. So I've been doing startups for 20 years now. The first company that I started was called 6 Degrees. And my focus has always been on where do I think there's about to be massive disruption in a space, and how can I build a company to benefit from that opportunity? So this was 1996, and I very much wanted to start an internet company, and I was looking for opportunities where I thought the world was about to change. And the opportunity I began to focus on was this idea that if everybody indexed their relationships in a single place, you could see the people you don't know through the people you do. And if you think about what a social network is, at the core of a social network is this centralized indexing of people's Rolodexes, for lack of a better way to put it. And while people have been networking since the beginning of time, there was never an opportunity to do it seamlessly because the technology didn't allow it. And so I launched a company. I was an attorney. I quit my job and I launched a company called 6 Degrees. We literally filed a patent on this idea that we could index everyone's relationships in a single place by having one part of that relationship ask the other for permission to memorialize that relationship. That I think has become the definitive patent on social networking, and built a company called 6 Degrees, which was really the first online social network and the largest, I think, community site from 97 to 99 when we sold that business.
Okay, so you had an exit. Who did you end up selling the business to?
A company called Youthstream Media Networks, public company in New York.
Do you ever regret selling it?
I mean, regret selling it. Social networks, a lot of people, a lot of people ask, what's the big difference between 6 Degrees and Facebook? One of the things about social networks is they're constantly reinvented. 6 Degrees was the biggest, and then there was Friendster, and then there was MySpace and Facebook, and people don't recognize that social networks capitalize on the mediums of the times. So 6 Degrees had no pictures. It sounds like a crazy concept that someone would offer a social network without pictures, but the fact was,
what were the features then? Was it like a lot of chatting? People could message each other?
I mean, there was, a lot of it was searching. I mean, we had, the capability even we actually thought about 6 Degrees as a operating system where you could say, who do I know that knows someone that's seen that movie or reviewed that, reviewed a book or a product. And that was how we conceptually thought about it. So we introduced that notion of recommendations. But the reason we didn't have pictures was people don't realize that our users didn't have.
No way to take them back then, really, right?
Our users didn't have digital photographs of themselves,
right.
And so, I remember we talked about, literally, we had people writing in, could we put together almost assembly line, if you will, of interns that would open up paper mail and scan in photos and associate them with profiles. And that wasn't a a realistic opportunity. But what's happened? So your question was, do I regret? I mean, these businesses were extraordinarily expensive to run. I mean, we'd raised $26 million, which was a lot of money at the time.
A ton of money back then. Yeah.
Probably a small amount of money to raise for a social network, a thriving social network. Today, although social networks can get going on far, far less capital.
Right. Yeah, I guess startups back then were not very capital efficient.
No, but what was interesting was, but if you look at the progression of social networks, every time that a new medium has exploded, we've had a new social network. So, for example, Europe had SMS, widespread usage of SMS far before we did, because we didn't have interoperability of the phone carrier. So you were certain that your AT&T text message was delivered to a Verizon user. But once it was, well, that correlated with the first incarnation of Twitter. Which
I'm getting a little static. Do you have a mic or something that's bouncing against your shirt?
It might be. I'm gonna not move.
Okay.
So once we had SMS, we had Twitter. When we had the ecosystem that supported apps, we have, for example, Instagram takes off, or so we've seen these reincarnations, and it's very difficult in hindsight to say, wow, I wish I had stayed the course and raised substantially more capital. It was what it was. I try to look forward, not back.
Yeah, I mean, back then you had no idea what the future of social networking was ever going to turn into. What was the next startup after 6 Degrees?
It was called Joltage. It was early 2000s. I think it was 2001, and I was Wi-Fi was pervasive in every corporate environment, and I was convinced that there would be Wi-Fi. We would literally run out of bandwidth. Wi-Fi is unregulated radio spectrum. So I was convinced that we would rely more and more heavily on unregulated radio spectrum, on Wi-Fi, and there would be Wi-Fi in every hotel, airport, coffee shop. And I remember going into some of the biggest coffee chains and saying, you need to offer Wi-Fi. And they would tell me, if we put Wi-Fi here, the users will never leave. And I would say, if you don't put Wi-Fi in here, they'll never come.
Right, they'll go somewhere
else. So we built what's called an operational support system, which is the back end infrastructure that allows for the provisioning, authentication, remuneration to broadband provider. Actually, the entire back end support for what you would need to offer a hotspot, or either a pay hotspot or even a free hotspot in public places. So that was the next startup. And then I built a company. Then I thought that that political campaigns, I mean, it's funny now. It's so obvious. You come off this last presidential election, and someone like Bernie Sanders raises all of his money online, and it seems so obvious that people give in micro donations, but people don't remember that it used to be that the way you raise money was you got bigger sized checks from people at events. And so I started one of the first companies to focus on a turnkey solution for political candidates to raise online capital and micro contributions.
That company was called I Stand For?
That was called I Stand For. And we had, gubernatorial house, Senate races. So I sold that business. And then I started 2 mobile businesses. One was location-based mobile dating. This was even before there was an iPhone. We were reverse triangulating the position of phones on our own, dumb phones. And started a company called Xtify, which was a mobile CRM. And I had transitioned my own model from being CEO to being a chairman and hiring a CEO for each business. I co-founded those 2 with my CTO at the time, my partner now at Indicative, a guy named Jeremy Levy. And we sold, in 2013, we sold Xtify to IBM, and we sold Meet and Wada Match. And Jeremy Levy and I started this other company, this business analytics company called Indicative.
Do you prefer the chairman role versus the CEO role?
You know, um, I think at different times in my life, I have a preference for each. I mean, when you're the chairman, there can only be one leader at a company. I really believe that someone who makes final decisions at a company. And I mean, there are models where people have found co-CEOs work, but I have not found that to work. So what's interesting about the chairman role is I have a great relationship with the CEO at Indicative, for example, but we have a very clear understanding that um, the CEO is the CEO. The chairman um, doesn't make the overwhelming majority of decisions. So you need to have if you're going to play a chairman role, you need to have a very close relationship with the CEO. And if you think that you can take a chairman title and
And, and,
make it
and the
and make it
board too, right? The board of directors.
well, the chairman is the chairman of the board of directors, right?
Right. Okay.
So the chairman, there are decisions that are appropriate for the board of directors that come up to the board of directors that the board decides. But when you make hiring, firing, investment decisions, a lot of those, unless they rise above a certain level, are not board decisions. They're CEO decisions. And so, that means that if there's a, run of the mill decision that the chairman and the CEO disagree with, even though the chairman is the chairman of the board, it's the CEO who makes the final decision, uh,
So
uh, notwithstanding what the chairman thinks. So
talk to
you
us about. Oh, I'll keep you. Sorry. Didn't want
no,
to
so you need to have a good relationship to be, to work with someone who has the final decision.
So talk to us about this Andrew's roadmap. So this is a boot camp that you started. When did you start it, and what is the what's the basis, or what exactly are you guys doing?
So the idea is that in order to be a great entrepreneur, you really only need to do one thing that's different. One thing. That one thing could be your product, it could be the way you market. You need to do just one thing. You don't need to reinvent the wheel in everything. But there is a best practice for everything. I mean, there may be multiple best practices for the different disciplines you'll confront, and I'll explain to you what I mean by that. Um, so and you should learn. There are two thoughts I have on entrepreneurship. One is you, an entrepreneur, should learn best practices. So, and I'll talk with you about what I mean by that in a second. That's one. And the second is you as a CEO must have a minimal level of proficiency in every discipline. So let me take those in reverse turn. You see people start and they'll say, look, I got a technology concept. I don't really know anything about technology. I don't want to know anything about technology. I'm going to hire other people. My real skill is marketing and sales, but I can hire people to take care of the technology. Those people, by and large, will not be successful. If you have a technology concept, you don't need to become a programmer, but you need to have a bare minimal level of literacy in what it means to architect a product. In fact, you literally should, even if you have to do it with pen and paper, you should architect what your website, what your digital offering looks like if your core offering is a technology solution. And that's true across the board. If you're in the B2C space and you're going to be engaged in digital marketing, but you have no idea how a Facebook campaign works or no idea how buying Google AdWords work, you're not going to be successful. You cannot fully outsource any discipline or manage either in-house or out-house people without having a minimal level of competency. So that's one construct.
So what do you recommend in cases like that where a non-technical person wants to start a technical type business? Should they just learn the basics or just stay away completely?
So you have to think about what that means. If you want to start um, a e-commerce offering, and it's really an online offering. You're not building stores. You've got a product. You want to sell a product online. If you're a self-starter, whether you're a self-starter or not, you've used websites before. You've purchased a product on Amazon before. you can initially play the role of information architect. If you don't, first of all, there are web programs that allow you to design a website that you can pick up in a few hours.
Right.
It doesn't mean
Nowadays, you can use
program.
Shopify and BigCommerce and,
I'm
and
even
sites
thinking,
like that.
that's to integrate. That you would need a programmer for. I'm talking about things like Balsamiq that allow you to literally sketch it out. But you don't even need to do that. You can literally take printer paper, and a pen and handwrite out what your site looks like. Great companies, CEOs are the head of product across the board. I mean, great companies, whether you're looking at a Facebook or a Google or a Microsoft or an Apple, Steve Jobs was always the head of product.
Right, right.
And so if you abdicate that role from the get-go, you're just not likely to be successful. And that doesn't mean you have to become a programmer, but that does mean you have to have a very strong perspective on what it is you want to build, because most people build something that is wrong. And the brilliance of companies is not getting it right. It's when you build something and 99% of it's wrong and 1% of it's right, is recognizing the 1% and having the ability to iterate on the other 99%. And so hopefully when you launch your second version, you've got 2% right and then 3% right. That's the much more likely model to success than you build something and you're, magically you put up a Pez dispenser and all of a sudden you've got eBay, right? That's the former model of iteration and persistence. That's the path to success.
So
And
what types of companies are you guys having come through the boot
I
camp?
mean, we've had hundreds of companies. Most of them are digital. So,
Okay.
and they run the gamut. And the other piece I didn't mention was, the first piece was, what is best practices? I mean, I give people, what does a marketing plan look like? What does a sales plan look like? What does a product plan look like? What do cash flow projections look like? And they get templates for all this. What does a business plan look like? And they get a template for the business plan. And what does a commission structure look like for an enterprise sales team? What does a commission structure look like? How do you think about
Because I mean, for first-time entrepreneurs, these are things that they've never seen before, or they've never had to learn before, right?
That's right. So there's a twofold message. One message is you can use a best practice, but the second message is, but you can't just give this to someone else. Like, even, my background is, I was an attorney and briefly an investment banker. So, I happen to understand finance. But there's some people who say, look, well, I know product, but I can't deal with finance. So I'm going to completely throw that over the wall. And it's too difficult for me to get even a core understanding, a base level understanding of finance. So just tell me what to do. And I'd say, no, there's great CEOs have proficiency. They're not experts, but they have proficiency in every discipline. And then what they do is they hire people that are smarter than them in every discipline. So, and if you do those two things, you're proficient in every discipline, you hire people that are smarter than you in every discipline, that's the recipe to starting a great business.
That makes a lot of sense. Never really had anyone put it that way before, but when you think about it, it seems that does work.
Yeah. So and these people that, it's funny, you get a sense for it. If you meet with lots of entrepreneurs, you get a sense for people that, great entrepreneurs, when they share with you their idea, they send you a business plan, they don't bring their entire team to the meeting. And so it's perfectly reasonable to say, look, you're asking me about scalability and I'm not the CTO, but I'd refer those questions. I'll get back to you that's understandable. But there's a base level of questions you ask people. Like, for example, when you're marketing, what's your cost of acquisition? What's your lifetime value? If you've got a B2C, even if you have a B2B, you should have a sense of a lifetime value. What's churn look like? And there are people that will talk intelligently about all of these topics, notwithstanding the fact that they don't have a marketing background, or notwithstanding the fact that they don't have a sales background, they can still talk about a pipeline, or notwithstanding the fact they don't have a technology background or a product background, they can talk about the intricacies of their product and what they think would be exciting. And you get a sense immediately, these people are going to make it. And it's not because they're the smartest person with respect to all these topics, it's because they have a perspective with respect to all these topics. And because they understand, they have the humility to understand that they're going to need an expert in every one of these topics, but that's not an excuse for them not having this minimal level of competency.
When's the right time for an entrepreneur to come to the boot camp?
Um, you know, there's this famous quote from um, from Goethe, uh, the German philosopher, who said, "At the moment of commitment, the world conspires to assist you," which I never realized how um, truthful that was until I started my first business. At the moment of commitment, the world conspires to assist you. And this is, I'm going to answer your question, when's the right moment to come. Once you make a commitment in your head that you're moving forward, the same people who said to you, you'll never raise financing, all of a sudden say, I know someone who knows a investor, an angel investor, or you'll never hire developers. That same person will say to you, it turns out I have a friend of a friend who's a developer who's looking for a job. And so what I say to people is we have an application process for some of our boot camps. We have 2 boot camps. One we have an application process for, one we don't. But we look for people that have the basic attributes of what I'm describing as a great entrepreneur and have clearly made the commitment to move forward. And that's the right time to come to our boot camp, as opposed to, I'm not sure whether I want to move forward or not. But the right time to come is the earliest stage, but you've crossed that moment of commitment in your head.
And
Which is, by the way,
you guys do these in person in New York, right?
Yeah. We do them a couple of times a year.
When's the next one?
Then the calendar on the next one will shortly go up on our website. We haven't announced the date.
Okay, cool. And how big are these classes?
We take about 50 entrepreneurs, 50 CEOs at a time.
Cool. From all over the place, all over the world?
They come in from all over the world, yeah.
Awesome. And what are they, like a week or even shorter than that?
No, we do them in 48 hours. They're intense. Wow.
That's a lot of information. A
Yeah.
lot of information in 48 hours.
Yeah. I lecture for 8 hours on a Saturday and 8 hours on a Sunday. They're intense.
Wow. Talk to us about, what's the common thread for success through all these companies that you've been involved with over the last 20 years? Like we said, there's a ton of different industries involved. You guys were at the forefront in terms of innovating in many of these industries before anyone else was. And then in some cases you sold off to a larger company. What, and maybe it's just the basics, like you said, knowing a little bit of everything, but hiring people smarter than you in each of those areas. But
so
what else?
It's interesting. It's a good lead. It's a good lead into the podcast I have now called Predicting Our Future. This is my thesis about, or this is my perspective about entrepreneurship. Great entrepreneurs are not inventing industries that would not have occurred in their absence. Let me explain to you what I mean by that. Bill Gates famously said, Microsoft will be responsible for, I'm paraphrasing here, a computer on every desktop. So does that mean that but for Bill Gates and Microsoft, we wouldn't have a computer on every desktop? But for Steve Jobs, we wouldn't have iPhones? But for Elon Musk, we would not have this huge excitement about electric vehicles? No. These people moved industries dramatically forward, but they capitalized on a history of supporting technology that brought the times to a moment where they were able to capitalize on a new vertical. So, there was decades of technologies that enabled a computer to be put inside of a phone at the moment that the iPhone was introduced. And so I think in many ways, this is what I look for. I think in many ways, entrepreneurs are like surfers. So if you've ever surfed, you paddle out your board, and then at some level, there's a little bit of a waiting game and a hoping game that your board is going to be in the right position when the wave comes in. And you choose where to surf. You choose where to put your board. And then if you're right, if you have, if you made the right choice about where to put your board, well, that wave is going to carry in all the surfers that are in that area. And so the analogy here is this. I think that great entrepreneurs start by developing a macro thesis. And the macro thesis is bigger than them. They say, look, I've done a research in a space, and my perspective is that, here's the most simplest one, it's the 1990s, and your perspective is, I believe commerce is going to move out of a brick and mortar context and move online. And so I'm going to identify a vertical that is hopefully ripe, one of the earlier verticals to move online. And you see this idea of people predicting macro trends well before they build a business. So big data will change healthcare. Why? Because if you can analyze everyone's condition, everyone who's ever taken for example, a drug that has some unintended benefits, but you can look at millions and millions of people, you might be able to determine a cocktail of drugs that's uniquely suited for a certain type of person. And that's an example of a macro perspective. And so what I think the common thread is through the businesses I've started is I look for macro trends before I get going. And, so for example, I believed social networking would forever change with the internet. I believed that people would want to use high-speed internet in public places. I believed candidates would raise money online. And I believe all of those things were true, whether or not I started my businesses. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. I mean, a lot of it is timing, right? I mean, in some cases, you might have actually gotten into some of those industries too early.
Yes, it's the definition of timing. What I'm describing is the definition of timing. Like what I try to do when I raise money for a business that I start is I walk in and I say, let me just tell you what I think the future holds. I think this is true whether or not I start a business. In fact, I believe this is true, that if you don't invest in me, you should find another company to invest in that you think is smarter than me or can execute on this better than me. But I believe that this future will happen with or without me. So buy into the future. And I've had meetings where I've gone to raise capital. Happy to share with you a funny one where someone says, I think you're crazy on the future. And then I say, well, then there's nothing to talk about with my specific business. I was telling you about that company, Xtify. I met with one of the more well-known venture capitalists in New York when I started that business. And I said, look, this was, the iPhone had just been released, or the Android had just been released, and it was tiny, tiny market share. And I said, there are only going to be two operating systems in the future. One is the iPhone and the other is Android. And you have to believe that before I describe to you my business. Now, I said that because at the time we were only able to build our infrastructure around Android, our client around Android. And the venture capitalist said to me, there will only be two operating systems. It'll be BlackBerry, which is RIM, and the iPhone. And I could not convince him otherwise. And so I never described my business to him. That was, the meeting ended because I couldn't get him to buy into my macro thesis.
Yeah, I guess it's better to be early than late, right?
I think it's better to be early than late. If you look at the most successful companies, they're by and large, they're the second mover, not the first.
Right.
But
very true, right? Google, Facebook,
none of those were first movers. Yeah.
Right. Absolutely. I don't know about Uber. Uber might have been first, but
no. I mean, there were companies before Uber that
right.
were
there was taxi apps. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah. These people learned from what had been done before.
What are you the most excited about now? I mean, not necessarily, like what new projects are you working on besides being the chairman of Indicative and running the boot camps? I mean, I know you like trying to predict the future in different industries or any industries.
I did a very extensive piece, a six-part episode on modular housing. That I'm a big believer, the same way you're seeing massive excitement about a company like Tesla. Tesla makes a fraction of the cars that General Motors does, but has a market cap now that's larger than General Motors.
Crazy.
It's shocking that homes are fundamentally built the same way. Apartment buildings are fundamentally built the same way they were 50 years ago.
Yep.
And that we haven't seen But it's not
There's
true
no,
that we,
there's no streamlined process for home building other
yeah,
than hiring contractors and they come over and they nail in one piece of wood by a time,
right,
one at a time.
right. I mean, I would suggest to you that there will come a point in the future where when your neighbor tells you that she built a home with a local contractor, you would say, that's crazy. I don't know anyone else on the block who's done that. And that time will come. When it comes, by the way, in certain parts of the world, that time's already here. Like a majority of single family homes in Sweden are built in factories.
And
And
so they're just delivered essentially and put together, assembled on site.
yeah, I mean, I did this episode called Half Price Hamptons. There are $10 million homes in the Hamptons that are made in factories that if you looked at, you would say, there's no way that's made in a factory. But in fact, it is. And
I would probably love them because they probably look very modern, right?
they can look, what's incredible is they can look modern, they can look, they can look like,
Rustic.
more, they can look rustic, they can have, traditional, more traditional sort of shingle look. I mean, they can do anything. I mean, it's just what's in this country. We don't really have vertically integrated construction. So what you typically find is, to the extent there, by the way, and there are factories, but what you would typically find is that there are factories that are different than people that are transporting the modules, that are different than the people that are digging your foundation, that are different than people that are weather tightening on site. It's not a vertically integrated. By the way, even if you do traditional building, the plumber is usually a different company than the electrician, which is a different company than the framer, than the tiler, than the carpenter. It's not. There are companies that are vertically integrated, but it's not the way you think about other products.
Right. It's not
And
very
so,
efficient. I mean, I've seen houses get built and it's, most of the time there's no one even working on the house. They're just trying to coordinate all these different service providers, like you said, electricians, plumbers, all coming over at different times. And, it takes 8 to 12 months to build a house in some cases because of it.
yeah, that's the best way to put it. It's not efficient.
Do you think you'll ever get involved in that industry?
Maybe. Um,
Do you think you'll ever, do
maybe.
you think you'll ever start another company or more likely as an investor?
I don't know. I'm still in the learning. I'm very much. I mean, I love when I think about what I enjoy doing. I love learning about these new spaces, and I mean, even when I was aggressively starting businesses, for every 10, 20 ideas I had, I only did one of them. But they're fascinating to learn. I find it makes you smarter. Your mind, becomes crisper when you do deep dives into these different verticals. You try to imagine it's a great deal of fun to try to imagine what does the future hold. And then only after you say, what does the future hold? Then you begin to say, well, can I play a part in that? And I like to say good founders have the right mix of arrogance and humility, right? The arrogance is, that I can play a role in being disruptive, that I can do something, and
Right. I
build
can do
something
this.
big.
Nobody's going to stop me.
Right. And the humility is, that, well, first of all, there's a lot of people that are thinking about the same thing you are. And what you need to do is position yourself as the smartest, one of the smartest in the space. And the humility, is recognizing, wow, there's so much I don't know. And there's so much I have to learn. And I think if you can find yourself in a position where you enjoy that learning, well, that's an exciting way to approach entrepreneurship.
What was your process, or do you have a process, back when you were starting companies on trying to filter out the good ideas versus the bad ideas? And, like you said, if you had 10 or 20 ideas, you only pick one to move forward with.
I mean, for me, this is what my process, I bet you would mirror how most people process ideas. I come up with an idea. I get really excited about it. And then, far from being secretive, I share it with everyone. And the smartest people I know, I share it with. And I get their feedback. And you know, usually if you can engage really smart people, to me doesn't mean highest IQ. It means people that are likely to have a perspective on the space. They're either entrepreneurs or venture capitalists, or they're operating in the space or near the space. And I process their feedback. For many of the businesses that I've started, the feedback was mostly negative. And then I gauge my excitement. And it's rare that when I start an idea, I'm as excited about it 3 months after I came up with the idea than I was when I generated the idea. But if I'm still excited, then in my mind, that's one of the critical components to getting going. The other critical component is the thing that separates entrepreneurs from other people is, or non-entrepreneurs, with respect to business, is they're able to create momentum out of nothing. So they do things, anything. Maybe they get other people to join them. Maybe they to commit to join them. Maybe they, mock up what it's going to look like. Maybe they write a business plan. They just do things that create momentum. So my litmus test, my process is, if I'm doing things that are moving the ball forward and I'm excited after a certain period of time, then it's a good idea for me. But I find it really hard to create momentum and be excited after most ideas. So that's my process. Is as rough as it is, as rough as it sounds. But I think if other people engage in that same process, like there are people that have had the same idea for 5 years, they do nothing, and they come in and out of other ideas. That's not a good idea for them.
Let's talk about failure. I like talking about failure, not because I'm a mean or negative person. I just think there's a lot to learn there. For maybe either use your own personal experiences or perhaps some of the startups that have come through your boot camp. What are some of the reasons that you've seen failure?
Well, I'm happy to use one of my own. So the businesses I told you about, the second one went under. The one that built hotspots in public places.
Okay.
And I spent a lot of time thinking about why that business. We had raised capital. I probably had 15 people, mostly engineers working for me. It was a tough time to raise capital. This was after the market
after the dot-com bubble.
This was after the dot-com bubble. The market had crashed. But the truth was that I don't attribute that to the biggest problem. I talked to you before about macro thesis. I had a perspective about inevitability. And I had two perspectives. One perspective was that there would be public Wi-Fi in every place. And the other perspective was that people would have plans, much like you have a phone plan, to pay for it. And that it would all be paid. So you would buy a plan from us or one of our competitors, and it would be your data plan. And it would not be from Verizon, AT&T, or T-Mobile. And what was interesting was I talk a great deal about this company in the boot camp, this one, which was a failure, probably more than the ones that were successes. Because a good entrepreneur constantly revisits their macro theses. And when they realize that those macro theses are wrong, that's when they pivot. And so it should have become apparent to me sooner that people were not going to pay for data plans. Yeah. And what's interesting was another company started about the same time that we did, and you still need a operation support system even if you're going to offer free Wi-Fi. And so hotels were coming to them and saying, "Could you position our access points? Could we use your operation support system?" We said no. They said yes. We went under. They sold for several $100 million. And because my perspective was, we're not in the installation business. And I should have said yes. I should have said yes because in hindsight, well, they sold for a lot of money and we didn't. I should have said yes because I should have been re-examining these macro theses that I had and whether or not they continue to be accurate and whether or not, therefore, my business model continued to be sensible. And I didn't do that fast enough. And the result was the company failed. So I thought that was a real teachable moment. Although, when a business fails, you don't say, wow, I had a teachable moment. You say this is terrible, but you get back on your feet, and hopefully you recognize for the next business that that you won't make the same mistake. And so the mistake there was not having a great enough I was not engaged fast enough in revisiting these big picture assumptions that underlay my business model. And I see that a lot of times with failures. People come up with interesting ideas. I don't know whether they're right or wrong, but they don't revisit quickly enough. And you're able at some point during the progression of the business to see that they're wrong, but they don't revisit at a point where they can reach that conclusion on their own, and then they go under.
So last question. I get a lot of entrepreneurs that message me, email me, whatever, and they tell me that they have this great idea. They just don't know if they're really cut out to be an entrepreneur. I mean, have you seen that with your boot camp where someone comes in there, a team comes in there with a great idea, but you just don't think that they have kind of the chops to be an entrepreneur and build a company?
What was interesting was you asked me, what do I do when someone asks me if they have the chops, as opposed to me assessing? There's a difference. I mean, the one thread you see for all great companies is, almost all great companies, is they're around for an amazingly long period of time. Like, most exits of any note occur 7+ years, maybe 10+ years,
Right.
not 1 or 2 years. And one of the interesting things about that is you don't know what you don't know, and you don't know what is coming down the pike. So there's often this experience that businesses have, that entrepreneurs have, where the same way they get hurt by a down climate, they benefit from things that they never could have imagined just because they're in business, just because they stayed alive. And so staying alive is a huge part about being a successful entrepreneur, just staying alive. And if someone's asking you the question day one, I'm not really sure whether I have the energy to do this or I can stay with this, it's not likely when they hit a rough patch that they're going to stay with it. And the entrepreneurs that say, I'm going to run off a cliff with this, I'm going to just keep going and going and going and going, those folks are more likely to be successful. And it's not because they're smarter or they have more experience. It's just that they have the persistence and the certainty that they will stay alive come what may. So it's a tricky question you're asking me. What do I do when if I try to understand, if someone says to me, do I have the chops? I try to understand why they're asking that. But you can tell in a room of entrepreneurs, people that are going to go the distance.
Right.
And those people just have a much, much higher likelihood of success.
Right. Awesome advice, man. Really appreciate you coming on the show today. I know you have your website, andrewsroadmaps.com. Any other websites or social media accounts?
And predictingourfuture.com.
Okay, cool. I'll add that to predictingourfuture.com. Is that where that's the podcast, right?
That's the podcast. Yeah.
Okay, so people can get to the podcast through that link.
Absolutely.
Are you guys on iTunes as well? We're
on iTunes as well. Yep.
Okay, cool. And then what about on social media? Which ones do you use often? Follow you?
Andrew's Roadmaps is the best place to follow me.
Okay, on Twitter?
On Twitter, yeah.
Cool. Thank you so much, man. I really appreciate your time. Keep up the great work and look forward to staying in touch with you.
Thank you.
Cool. Talk to you soon, Andrew. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.